reconnecting after our graduation, we had this wacky idea. What if we brought this east and had an East Coast outpost of LichensCitiSci? And I just want to thank Hannah for being willing to give that a try. And I couldn't imagine anything better than bringing together the two parts of my climate justice world, healthcare workers and people in the Episcopal Church. So thanks for being willing to try that too, because this might be an interesting audience, different than what you've addressed in the past. So with that, take it away, Hannah.
Well, thank you for the introduction and for being so welcoming today and leading up to this. I'm very honored to be here. And before we get into it, I just want to preface that I am no expert in anything. I am a lifelong learner. And so I'm constantly trying to expand how I'm seeing things and how I'm sharing what I'm learning in the process. So this will be a journey for all of us. And I welcome any questions or comments. And I believe there will be time at the end for that. But if we're going through and you're just kind of confused or want to stop and talk about something for a second, please let us know. I don't want anyone to be left behind in conversation or anything like that. So if all that sounds good, I guess we'll get started. Okay, can everyone see my presentation screen? Awesome. And I also wanted to say my camera is on one computer and my presentation is on another. So if you see me turning both ways, it's for that reason. And one last disclaimer is I do live on a fairly busy street. And so occasionally I might just mute out of nowhere to protect you from a loud diesel engine going by. So on that note, we will get started. So we're here today to talk about LichensCitiSci, and it's a community science project engaging publics in lichen biomonitoring work. I've already been introduced, so I don't need to go over that again, but I do want to just thank all the partners here, and here we go. So I would like to acknowledge that for this project, we know that we're partnering with the U.S. Forest Service and that they are current stewards of some lands in North America, but that we also recognize Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the United States national forests and grasslands and respect the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples, and their traditional territories. We also acknowledge the ethnobotanical use of lichens by Indigenous populations. So before we really get into it, if everyone could just close their eyes for a moment and take a few deep breaths. Take slow inhale, slow exhale, and just be really present with your breath. And in that process, think about anything you can smell and just feeling the benefits of inhaling and exhaling the air that you have. So one thing I can say across all of us in this meeting and for those who might be listening later is that we all share in the need for air, right? That's something we can all connect on no matter what walk of life we are or where we come from or anything like that. We do share air. And so that's kind of the lens to take as we explore today's conversation. So it can be difficult to make an argument with society that biodiversity matters. It is more accessible to make an argument that air quality matters because everyone breathes air and is impacted by air quality. So can anyone tell me what they see in this image? Just, pop off your mute and just feel free to chime in.
I would say that the split screen between like clear air quality and perhaps smog. Yeah.
Has anyone ever been in the wilderness or at a park or any sort of natural landscape and seen the sort of hazy view before? Yeah, a few people. So that's exactly right. This is a split image in Southern California showing where there's impaired air, haze is in the air from different pollutants. And then on the other side is a clear sky where the air is less impacted. And this is just a split screen to show how monitoring efforts really do make big impacts. And this is coming from the US Forest Service and the Improved Monitoring Collaborative Project. So something a lot of people don't know is that air is actually a federally protected resource. Similarly to timber or mineral, air as a resource requires different, it takes different legislation and regulation to protect it or to monitor it, right? So because of the Clean Air Act, air is monitored and protected. Is everyone familiar with the Clean Air Act? A little bit, yeah. So essentially in the 1960s, the air was pretty bad in North America. And in 1970 is when the EPA was more like officially founded. But the precursor to that in the 1960s worked to begin different regulations around air. And when the Clean Air Act came in 1970, we got the first set of nationwide standards that allowed for a more unified set of expertise and regulation to help monitor and protect the air. Something really big to note is that there's this thing called ambient air quality. And so that is the air at its most natural state without any pollutants. And so that is sort of the baseline that then everything is based off of when monitoring the air. We'll get into it a little bit more. So how did we get here? So before the Clean Air Act, there were a lot of polluted cities, a lot of people getting sick and dying, visibility decline, like we saw in that previous split screen photo. There was a lot of black clouds in the sky, smog, waterways were polluted. I mean, it kind of sounds familiar, right? But what we see today would have been far worse had we not had these regulations implemented over the past several decades. So one of the big things that emerged in the 1960s and turning into the 70s was this idea of AQI, Air Quality Index. Everyone's a little bit more familiar with it today. If you open your weather app on your phone, you'll see your AQI. And so essentially it's a really complex set of calculations that look at very specific pollutants, and they came up with a calibration to understand when we hit this number, it becomes unhealthy to life forms, right? And so there's a degree of measurement that helps us understand the air is clean, not so clean, pretty bad, like do not go outside bad, right? And you have to think a lot about that if you have any sort of health impacts, or if you're exercising, if you're a small child or someone who's in the older population. Through the EPA in the AQI development, there was also this National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We call them NOx. And we'll get a little bit more into that too. But the point of it is they pulled out 6 pollutants that really are dangerous when exceeding a limit. And when that limit is exceeded, that's when the AQI number gets high, and that's when you'd probably stay inside or wear a mask, that sort of thing. You can kind of imagine with all of the wildfires, people talk about AQIs in the 400s. Well, healthy, clean air is under 100. So it's kind of like, oh, wow, that's pretty bad, right? Their air must be pretty bad. Anyway, long story short, a lot of intense science went into helping create these systems that then help make science-based decision-making and regulation a process. So this is the EPA's AQI index, and you can see green, good, maroon, hazardous, right? I think, again, people are a little bit familiar with these, so I'm not going to go into it too much. And then the NACs, these are the 6 main pollutants that are heavily monitored. There are other things that are also monitored, but that's a different conversation. But I just want you to take note: carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particulate pollution, and sulfur dioxide. So how do we know what's in our air? We have to monitor, right? And so you have that ambient air, which is our baseline. We know this is what air looks like when it's clean and unpolluted. So what does air look like when it's polluted? Well, there are different types of monitors similar to cars. Let's say you can have your run-of-the-mill soccer van that you go to the grocery with every day. Maybe that's similar to like a purple air. But then you have state governments or EPA or larger agencies who have these really nice souped up air monitors that are very sophisticated and can track a number of things, right? So some people in this group might even have purple air sensors or some near them that they might monitor. So there's an example of one here. There's also biological monitors, which is kind of the point of why we're here today, to talk about lichens as biomonitors. But the long story short is that sophisticated science goes into calibrating any of these techniques, and specifically looking at these biomonitors, a lot of science has gone into understanding what sort of load does that life form have of pollutants that it's absorbed that can then be calculated in the lab. It's complicated, but we'll get more into it as well. Okay, so this is a fun exercise. So this is a set of particulate matter filters from collaborators of mine at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and it's a great teaching tool. So if you look at the bottom two on the right side, there's one that says Klamath Falls. It's very dark looking. It says 96.3% of limit. So that's the load of the pollutant on the screen. Then you look at the one directly to the right of it that says Portland, 160% of limit, and then it says the word exceedance. Does anyone have any idea what's going on here? So you'd think the one on the left that's much darker would be the more heavily polluted one. It looks terrible, right? Well, the one next to it, representing Portland, is actually at a higher pollutant exceedance, even though it is clear. Isn't that a little bit terrifying when you think about your air and you look around and you're like, well, it doesn't look hazy, we're probably fine. Well, some pollutants aren't as visible, right? They might be much smaller, they might have a different color, or they, things, science can be complicated here, but this is a very good eye-opening moment to recognize sometimes things might look really great outside, but they really might not be. And monitoring, measuring is really helpful to understand what actually is in the air. So I just wanted to take you on a little tour through a few versions of air monitoring. So this is your state, it might look familiar. And this is the New Hampshire government's air page. So they're looking at ozone and fine particulate. Any of those little round circles, those are the air monitors locations. And overall, it's green. Green is good. So the color scale here is based off of the EPA one we looked at a few minutes ago. And ultimately, it seems like you all have pretty good air, right? That's exciting for you.
Shocking how few that's all the official monitors around the whole state.
I appreciate that comment. And one of the notes I had here was thinking about the equity around the monitors, right? Like, are they in areas that may or may not be more at risk or more known impacted communities? Are they in areas where the geography or the geology and the weather patterns may or may not support cleaner or less clean air, right? Because air is moving constantly, and the different pollutants in air have different weights and different compositions, and so they may move at different rates. Oh, I think there's a question.
I just wanted to say that Manchester is the largest city with major central city heat islands. And there is no monitor anywhere near Manchester. And I also just wanted to comment and wonder if anybody else had heard about the latest report that came out that downgraded 5 of our counties regarding air quality, but it's not showing up yet in the data that you see online. So just to share that.
That's very fascinating because, again, air is moving, things are changing, and if these monitors are not equitably placed, you won't get a certain type of reading, right? And that's kind of what is leading into this work as we get further down. Here's a great NASA satellite image. So if you look at the one to the left, it's 2015 to 2019 average. New Hampshire has a little color in there, but the East is kind of significant here, right? And if you compare it to March 2020, when we all know what was going on then, there's a significant difference, right? In the different likely emissions here. And we'll get into that in a second as well. So this is looking at the EPA Air Now smoke monitors. And you see the dark colors up at the top. That's representing all of the really, really harsh wildfires happening in Canada right now. Really thinking about them a lot. They're going through a lot right now. And if you look at all of the dark color, that's the smoke traveling. And so you can see the orange and the yellow interspersed throughout the United States. And that's registering particulate matter from those fires all the way in the south, right? So I'm in New Mexico, and last weekend we had 150 plus AQI from the Canada wildfire particulate. Yeah. So again, thinking back to those filters we looked at and thinking about how air moves and the commentary about New Hampshire and the changing statistics of the air quality, air moves and so do pollutants. That's the takeaway. This is another great NASA satellite monitor looking at methane. And again, the darker colors and the more concentrated colors are showing you hot spots where there's an increased amount of methane. And this is from different types of emissions with methane. So does this image ring a bell to anyone? What do we think of when we see this?
The canary in the coal mine.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Bird die off first.
It's doom, right? A lot of doom here. So air quality is a global issue and it impacts all living systems. And poor air is an international public health and ecological concern. And because of human activity, we've polluted waters, air, and soil. And the reason I talk about water and soil here is that air touches every system. Air moves, pollutants move, and they get deposited, right? So in the whole cycle of things, it becomes to get really complex now. So there are really big impacts from poor air quality. Again, we've said human health, ecosystem, but also economic health, right? In this image here, you can see these are two different food crops, and these are damages by ozone, tropospheric ozone, which we'll get into in a second. So emissions from pollutants in air can also change climatic conditions. Greenhouse gases have the nickname as climate forcers. So we're getting this like complex interweb of like air quality, climate impacts, health and ecosystem impacts that then lead to economic impacts, right? If your crops are failing, how do you feed your family or your community or an entire nation, right? So this is a really great infographic. We don't have to look at all the details, but you can see where the pollutant sources are coming from: energy, transportation, industry. And then you can see inside the heart, these are all of the living systems that are impacted by these pollutant sources. And one of the big takeaways here is that some compounds that affect the climate are also powerful air pollutants, right? And that climate change and environmental pollution are a joint threat to biodiversity and ecosystems. You can see there's a direct connection of like pollutant source and problem and impact, right? So I mentioned tropospheric ozone, and I want to just make sure that we touch on this lightly. Tropospheric ozone doesn't have a direct emission source, but it is formed with sunlight and the interaction between sunlight and different pollutant sources. So in the bottom left, you again see that illustration of industry, transportation, emissions, and that sort of thing causing these pollutants mixing with sunlight, right? But the huge thing, the takeaway here is the impact section. It adds to global warming. It increases health effects and impacts and deaths. But really, the agricultural and the ecosystem impacts are things that people don't really talk about as much, and they're really important to note. And so I just wanted to point this out and make sure this is very clear that these different pollutants that are, again, part of that NOx EPA 6 pollutants of concern list have real detrimental effects to our future food security as well as our livelihoods. So air quality and climate change, it's really a complex, interwoven, escalating set of issues that continue to create new issues. The list here barely scratches the surface, and I think we all are familiar with these if we've been impacted directly or indirectly, or have community, friends who have also been impacted. Again, all of this is interconnected with air quality because air pollution and climate change share in the same sets of problems. Some air pollutants are also greenhouse gases, and they in turn lead to more climatic changes. And so something that's really fascinating about this work is that if we begin to really lessen emissions or to be really mindful about how these pollutants impact our air, we can then help prevent further degradation to our climate and these natural disasters and our food security and our food systems and human health and ecosystem health. Okay, so now we're gonna get into a little bit more of the fun stuff. That was a lot of doom and gloom, and I'm really sorry, but that's the reality of where we are today. So we see this picture again, but instead of a canary, we're looking at a lichen. And that is because lichens are very sensitive to pollution. And so they can tell us a lot about their presence or absence in an environment. What's happening? Is this a polluted space? Is this not a polluted space? Some lichens are a little bit more pollutant tolerant and some are more intolerant. And so the combination of understanding the lichen species and their form of habitat preference, you can start reading a landscape as if it's like cliff notes to like a polluted area. And so certain lichens tend to be, again, like I said, more tolerant or intolerant. And so the ones that tend to be tolerant are what we look at for lichen tissue sampling. And there's been some very sophisticated science that's gone into calibrating those lichen species to then be useful data tools in talking about air pollutants in wilderness areas, for example. They also are an affordable solution that does provide local direct data. So lichens play an important role as indicator species since they are very responsive to environmental stressors in forests, including changes in forest structure, air quality, and climate. So how do they do this? So lichens are, again, like on the branch of a tree, on limbs of the tree, and they absorb their nutrients and moisture from the air directly. And so any pollutant that might be in that air is also being absorbed into that lichen, and it's in their thallus. That is like their body, their tissue, right? And again, depending on the type of lichen and the type of pollutant source, different reactions happen with the lichen that since going back to the 1860s, they've been used as pollution bioindicators. There was a book published around, I guess, the turn of the century, maybe, that's called Our Vanishing Lichens, where it's based on work that happened in England during the Industrial Revolution and people noticing that the lichen ring or the lichen desert ring kept expanding. So where there used to be a lot of biodiversity of lichens, a lot of species presence, began to be a vast wasteland of no lichens. And again, maybe you saw more smog city, lots of dark clouds, haze, that sort of thing. So right here is a very brief list of some of the pollutants lichens can inform on when they're going through the lab. This is not a comprehensive list in any way, but this is just a very baseline list to help us think about this, right? So if you go back to that NOx list we looked at, 4 of the 6 pollutants of concern, lichens can help inform on. And that's really interesting. They're also just really cool for so many reasons. They can be food and habitat, they are medicine, they can be food for people as well, they're used in dyes. And again, they just tell us a lot about our environment. As I said, like going back to the 1860s is when they started to be used as bioindicators, and the US Forest Service started using them in the 1970s, because one of the things that they provide when you're in these deeper wilderness areas is great knowledge about that specific area, because they just live on that tree, right? So they're telling you a very localized set of information, but also you can't get heavy equipment up there. You can't get these energy dependent tools into these remote places, but these lichens are already there and they can tell you the same sets of information. So that's what got me to start LichensCitiSci. I co-founded this project with another fellow lichen aficionado and Forest Service person, Adrian, and we wanted to create a community science project that helped engage people around critical issues that impact our shared lands, right? And using lichens as bioindicators was a great way to do it, because you don't have to be really a technical expert to do this, but you do have to get trained, and that's what we try to offer in our training program. But once you figure out what you're doing, you actually can go out and do this with not much more than a Ziploc bag of supplies, which is pretty neat, you know? And once you get people out in the forest thinking about these things, it opens up opportunity to talk about biodiversity, shifting habitats, climate change, environment degradation, like forest fires. Like you just get this opportunity now that people have a new hook into the landscape, right? So our project has mostly been based in the Western United States, and in California, we tend to use this lichen, Lotharia vulpina, which is our logo lichen. So I like to give it a little bit of a shout out in this moment. It's kind of a cool lichen. It was used by indigenous people to kill wolves. It has a toxic substance in it that they figured out and would, cover their arrowheads with it. And they would use it for hunting, which is kind of fascinating, but that's why it's called vulpina. And it's also just a really lovely lichen, and I just like to give it a shout out. So what are we doing here? Well, we're trying to share what LichensCitiSci is up to see if anyone's interested in helping collect lichens in the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. And how does it work? Well, you'll get trained and certified, and then that data, once we go out and collect, will help us understand the air quality in the area, and we'll share that with our Forest Service partners and resource managers who are helping protect the air in other ways. So there are 3 phases in the project. It's a digital training program and certification program. There's field work where you're actually out collecting lichen tissue. And then there's the assessment where we look at the data and we review it and have discussions. And so the map here of California is interesting because the colored dots represent different lichen collections over a period of time. And similarly, as you might assume, green, pretty good, yellow, mediocre, red, not so good, right? And so we're learning a lot over these long-term lichen biomonitoring studies. And so the more sites we can create, or if we can revisit old sites and compare to baseline data, we can learn a lot about what's happening in an area over time. So in the training toolkit, it's hands-on, it's go at your own pace. It's online on a website. So if interested, you'd get a secret password and you log into the volunteer portal. And there are 6 sections for the training program. There's the welcome and orientation, tools, protocol trainings, resources, certification quiz video call, and then a user survey at the end so you can help us improve as well. One of the neat things about how it was designed is that we try and allow people to learn at their own pace within a window of time. We assume about 5 hours, but ultimately people have really done it in 2 or 3. But we just want to give people time because sometimes they want to rewatch the videos or they want to look at every single resource a few times. And then that also includes the certification quiz video call. In the toolkit, it was also designed to empower and support a variety of learning styles. So there are videos, there's a matching exercise, there's different visual and text-based guides. Then there would also be a live video and then a cohort community building component. So everyone going through the training together becomes a cohort. And then we have a nice Q&A with an expert. And that's really fun because then you get to ask questions directly to the scientists behind it. Once you are certified, you get your certificate. It looks a little bit like this. So imagine your name here. So you've been certified, and now it's time for field work. So the role that LichensCitiSci plays in this equation is we help get you trained, we help you find a place to go, and through your training, you'll learn what lichen you need to be collecting. So once you're in the field, this is kind of what it looks like. You're holding the bag with one hand, you have your gloved hand, and you're looking for the specimens. But ultimately, you need to just be really careful being out in the wilderness or in national forest lands. You know, weather can turn, you need to make sure you have your sunscreen and lots of water. So being prepared is very important. This is another example of what it feels like out in the field. Does anyone know why the lichens are growing about 6 feet up versus lower on the tree? That's the snowpack line. Yeah, isn't that fun to see that? Yeah. So one of the big things too you learn in the training is how and where to collect the lichens. And so this is an example of someone pulling them from higher up on a tree versus on the ground. We don't really want the ones on the ground. And you learn more about that in the training. So this group would be going to the White Mountain National Forest. And I think there's a tentative date of Saturday, June 24th, but again, we can discuss those details with the people who will be participating. And there are 2 lichen species we'll probably have you all look at in particular. And it's Platysmasia glauca and Flavoparmelia caparata. One of the cool things about the top lichen is that that image is actually from the White Mountain National Forest. So that's pretty cool. But something to also keep in mind that happens with field work is sometimes you don't collect anything, because things aren't present, the habitat has shifted since someone has been out there 10 years before, or sometimes you just can't find anything, you know, or there's not enough lichen to collect perhaps. And so coming back empty-handed is not a failure, but it's a learning opportunity. And that's another thing we'd get to talk about when we come back for assessment. So this is what your tools would look like. You have a Sharpie, you have a scale, you have a couple bags of tissue, and then you have some field data you'd have to record. So now we go into assessment. And again, this is when we would review the data, but sometimes that takes time. I think in my most recent discussion with the lab that we work with, our analysis is about a year out from when they receive it. So things get collected by you all in the field, they get shipped to a certain place. That place then cleans the lichens and sends them to the lab. So there's a few steps in between, but then it's a year from then that we'd have any sort of data. So it's kind of a slow process, but we'd all get back together on a video call and discuss what we've learned. And it's really important. The whole point of this project was to help resource managers at the Forest Service get more data in air quality biomonitoring, right? It's an affordable, easy to learn skill that we can send people out who don't have to be lichen experts, you don't have to be an air expert, but you have to be interested enough to want to do this, right? Because you do need to learn a few things, but it's not super technical, which is really kind of a neat opportunity here. And our data will help resource managers manage air, which is kind of cool. It'll join the national database and it will be factored into their work when they look at this information for regulatory and planning. So the thing about air is that it moves. If anything you walk away with today, that's what I want you to remember. But another thing that's kind of interesting is that the pollutants in air can also move, right? And that can cause a lot of harm, as we've learned, to human health, communities, the environment, and our future survival. And so in this very technical illustration, you can see that in the yellow, that's the pollution, right? And you can see that it travels vast distances and that it can pollute many different areas. You have your fence line communities, polluted waterways, or even polluted wilderness, right? So I leave you with that peace of mind. And I hope that if you're interested, you'll want to get involved and to help out and volunteer. We'll be sending an email out in the coming days with a link if you're interested to sign up. If you're not sure if it's right for you, happy to talk or have a follow-up call. But you can always follow us on Instagram or just look at our website or email anytime if you have questions. And then just a special thank you to all of our partners here. And that's it. Thank you for bearing with me.
That was awesome, Hannah. Thank you. And I just want to say too, if we know that summer is a busy time. So Hannah and I talked about the fact that if we get some people who sign up for the training and the 24th doesn't look great for some number of them, there's definitely the possibility of being flexible about that date. So don't, if you're going to a wedding on June 24th, don't walk away tonight thinking, I can't do this because I'm busy that day. We'll work with you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that presentation, and Deb for that extra information. I think sometimes we do get caught in those logistics and think, oh, I really do want to get involved, but there's a conflict. So that's fantastic to know that we can all be in touch with each other. At this time, it would be great if anyone has a question. I see, Lois, you have your hand up. If you want to pop on by voice, that would be great to ask Hannah a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah, for the best, most wonderful presentation about the thing I've always been in love with since I first took biology in high school, mosses and lichens. But that's not why I put my hand up. I will not be going to the White Mountains with my cane and my bad back and my knee. That doesn't work well either. But I have a couple of questions about doing this in urban areas. Is it possible?
Absolutely. And because you mentioned moss and lichens, I will forward along a collaborator of mine in the Pacific Northwest did a really amazing moss study in the city of Portland and found some really not great things from it that then led to further regulatory inaction. And again, thinking, Deb, to your comment about the equitable access of air monitors in certain areas, this study led to then the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality putting more air filters and air measuring devices throughout the city in a more systematic way. So I would happily share that. Yeah.
Thank you. I have more questions if others are okay with it. Does anybody else want to speak now? Because
I
have
know
more
that
questions.
Bob has his hand up. Why don't we bounce
Okay.
over to Bob and then head back to you, Lois?
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, well, I have a whole ton of questions too, so we can maybe
All right. You
rotate
can volley.
around. The lichens that are being collected, are they basically going to be analyzed for the amount of these 6 major pollutants that you mentioned that they contain? Is that what the data they're
Yeah, so there's 4 of those 6 that the lichens can inform on. And what happens is once they're collected, they get cleaned and then they get sent to this lab. And yeah, they crush them up essentially and like analyze them in some magic lab sorcery kind of way. And then that data would be what we would look at on the Forest Service side to like understand. So there's a lot of different calibration that's happened with the different species, so that some, again, are a little bit more telling than others. And did I answer your question?
Yeah. And is this actually a better way or an easier way than putting a bunch of synthetic monitors out in the forest, to get the same data? And if so, why?
Yeah, so it's a more affordable option. These already exist out there and you don't need a ton of them to tell you a lot of information. And in some of these areas, that technology wouldn't work. It wouldn't have the energy it needs. It would be very hard to get it physically to the location. And then the amount of maintenance on checking that data, right? Because you don't have Wi-Fi, it doesn't have electricity. Sometimes you can use solar power for some of these things, but honestly, that's not reliable either, depending on, right? Like if you're trying to use this for federal mandated monitoring. So lichens can be more effective and more affordable and more tangible in some of these wilderness settings.
And I'm curious, this cohort that you mentioned out in Portland, does that happen to be Sarah Joven? She
Absolutely.
is actually married to my nephew.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I just came back today from visiting them for about a week.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I told her I told her I was going to be watching this, and she wanted a report from me afterwards. So I'll let her.
I hope I got a good grade.
That is
you got
so
a great
cool.
grade.
What a wonderful connection.
And I just put 2 links in the chat, Lois, about Sarah's Portland project.
Thank you.
Yeah, she's an incredible collaborator, and I'm not just saying that because you're here.
No, she's a great person. She really is. Okay, I'll pass it back to Lois or anyone else who wants to ask something.
Anybody else want to go next?
Carolyn,
Yes.
you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question again. Jog, in terms of the commitment, you know, we have the videos, the certification, you have the training day, and then what's the time, the level of commitment you'd be looking for in order to meet the responsibilities of this study?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So in terms of just the training and certification, I estimate about 5 hours, but really it's maybe 3. But when it comes to actually doing field work, that's kind of on the individual, right? Some people are happy to go to a few locations. They want to go into the deepest wilderness possible, and they're just going out there and doing it. Some people are like, well, I have an afternoon, I could do it, right? And so it kind of, I'm trying to work, again, this is our first big pilot season. And so I appreciate any feedback on this process as people undergo it. But yeah, we're kind of working with individual volunteers in this way where it's supporting what they're willing to do and wanting to do, because it is their time and their resource to be able to do that. But then also encouraging, you know, it doesn't take a ton of time to go out into the field and collect, but you could make a day of it, right? And you could bring a bunch of people. So Deb's idea was maybe a group could go together and enjoy that experience, have good conversation. Maybe we come up with some like discussion topics to take on the trail with you. But if people wanted to do more or wanted to go further into the forest where they might have more luck collecting, then we could figure that out as well. So really agile system here.
Okay, yeah, that's why I wasn't sure whether you're signing up for to do over the course of a year, do so many visits to the forest, you know, like X number of visits to do collecting, or, but it sounds like that's very flexible.
Yeah, typically there's a collection season, and in the winter or during heavy fire season and things like that, like we don't want anyone in harm's way in any way. And then sometimes you might say, I'm going to go on Saturday afternoon, and then the weather tells you otherwise. So, you know, it's a very adaptable and agile system. But
yeah, I'll just say that for our project, what we were hoping was that people would on their own do the video training between now and June 14th. Is that right, Hannah? And that was the night, which is another Wednesday night. We thought we could have the check-in call that night, if that works for people. And again, if everyone who agrees to do the training says I'm busy on June 14th, we're gonna flex. So that there's the training on your own, the call, which will be an hour, right? And then the collection day, which we can decide as a group once we know who signs up for that, for the field work. If we had so much fun that we want to go 3 more times to 3 other places the rest of the summer, we could totally do that. But if we want to do one field day collection, that's our goal, is to at least do one. because Hannah and I didn't really know like who would sign up, who would commit, what would happen. So the initial commitment is simply do the training on your own, which we think will just take a little bit of time. Do the 1 hour call with Hannah and that's the certification call with the quiz, and then commit to the one collection day, which we think will be, not counting travel time. It does have to be within the White Mountain National Forest, since this is a National Forest sponsored project. We're looking at 3 very accessible trails because we're looking for good parking, bathrooms, and accessibility for people who might have little ones or mobility challenges or anything like that. And then the actual collection day hike probably won't be more than an hour or something, but if we want to bring bag lunch, talk together, etc., all that to be determined, but it's not meant to be more than like a half day field day. So we wanted easy access, easy commitment.
And to being really welcoming. Anyone's welcome to go through the training, even if they don't anticipate being in the field, or if they want to just stay connected, they can join parts of it along the way. We just need to know so we can remember to loop you into those parts.
Good point. So if say I trained, but on the day I had family members who wanted to come on the hike, they can come with. They just can't be the ones collecting the lichen. So that's another. Thank you for talking about welcoming.
Mm-hmm. And if someone did want to do the training after the training window, we can also work on that too. But we do want to make the note that we mindfully collect, right? So we're not just collecting to collect. We want to be very intentional and very specific, and we don't want to take life from the forest for no reason. Lichens play a critical role both on the macro and micro scale for organisms, for nutrient breakdown in the soils, to help us learn about our air. So we want to be very mindful of that dynamic, and we only really collect when we really know we should collect. And so again, in the training, you learn a little bit more about that too. But we don't just train people and then you're out at random. We train them and then we, organize that walk or that hike to ensure that we have a very specific amount of collection bags coming back to us, and we're not just collecting with no intention.
So shall I?
Yes, Lois, I was just going to ask you.
Okay, thanks. Hannah, I am with also the Environmental Justice Committee of the Manchester NAACP. We are in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, the New Hampshire Department of Environmental, and Manchester Health Department to do an air quality monitoring of local neighborhoods, because Manchester doesn't have any air quality monitoring going on. So we've been able, through the generosity of Nature Conservancy, I think we're going to end up having about 12 monitors, but there are many more neighborhoods than that in Manchester. And I was thinking of 2 things as I was listening. Wouldn't this be a wonderful verification of the accuracy? And it would also be something that would be so affordable in doing the neighborhoods we have no money to cover, and also doing some places that are non-designated heat island type neighborhoods to make a comparison to. So this is all going through my head, and I'm just a volunteer. I have no authority in this organization at NAACP. I just volunteer. But I was just thinking that this is like the perfect companion, because a year is no barrier, given that they're talking about 2 years before they get enough data to actually, say, okay, this is accurate. And we can go and plant a bazillion trees in these neighborhoods that are just so unhealthy. Yeah. So I was just wondering what you thought of the feasibility of getting that kind of thing up and running in a city.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've talked with Sarah before about her study and the replication of it, and it does seem like there could be benefits of working on something like that, but I do think there are things that need to be thought of in the process. Like, so what happens if and when you discover something really scary? Yes, we need to know about it and authorities need to be looped into it, but I think also being really mindful of the unfortunate doom that comes from headlines as well, right? And so this is where people live. This is their only choice, right? And being really, really respectful and mindful of if data is misinterpreted or taken out of context. And so I think that there are things that would have to be really thought about in order to do it really thoughtfully, right?
Yes.
But I'd be happy to hop on another call with other people and we could see what that means. If there's funding for something like that, I think we have expertise on my side to help with those things, but I wouldn't be able to cover, the whole,
No.
yeah. So I do think that there's conversations to be had and opportunities potentially, but being really thoughtful in the process.
Right, I agree. And the reason I love it is because I don't think we can wait for the EPA because the EPA will immediately be stopped, I believe, by the Supreme Court in being able to improve our situation as far as accountability for getting this air of ours healthier and cleaner. And so I think local initiatives that set our own health goals is a more likely avenue until things get better at the governmental court level. And I love this. So thank you so much, Anna. I will just bring this information to the people that have decision-making authority. Thank you.
Absolutely. And, the work you all are doing, every step counts, and the communities you're supporting are probably really grateful.
I had another quick question for you. Has lichen patterns been used at all yet to serve as an indicator for climate change or a way of monitoring climate change in different areas?
Absolutely. Again, going back to that presence or absence. So a cool thing about lichen, there's many cool things, but they're composite organisms coming together, right? So it's not just one living organism, it's multiple. And whatever cocktail you get, some have multiple fungal partners, some have multiple bacteria. And so depending on whatever that cocktail is, because of their symbiosis, they can live in places that the individual organisms could not live. Antarctica, a desert, a rainforest, very different places have very different habitats, right? And again, when lichen are present or absent in an area, you can read into that the way a geologist can look at rocks. You can say, well, these have disappeared, so they're very hypersensitive to this specific location. What is that telling us? Is it becoming drier? Is it becoming more polluted? Is it becoming hotter? When you look at a landscape, for example, even just a tree, looking at mosses or lichens, you have very different communities that are on the soil, that are on the bark, that are on different parts of the branches, the upper part of the branch or the lower part of the branch, canopy of the tree, base of the tree, right? And so you have very different subset of these communities that have very hypersensitive specifications of where they are in space. So that climate condition is really right for them. They're getting enough moisture, enough clean air to thrive, right? And so then you can also say, well, the health of this community has changed. It's gotten smaller. Another community is now taking over this community. So that's why monitoring over time can tell so much, because you really can watch that dynamic play out if you're lucky enough to see it. Yeah.
And didn't you also say that some of the 4 of the 6 compounds that are being tested in lichen are also greenhouse gases, right? Like ozone was one of them.
Yeah, and I can pull the slide up. Let's see. But yeah, I mean, lichens can be tested for heavy metals, nitrogen, sulfur. And so, you know, nitrogen's one where they really talk about lichens being the canary in the coal mine. And you think about different ag industry and things like this. Some lichens are very nitrogen forward and they want a lot of it. So all of a sudden in a landscape, you have this introduced lichen that wasn't here before. And so you can kind of say, oh, there must be some excess nitrogen in this area that's being emitted somehow that's creating this habitat that they're thriving in, right? So that's an instance where their presence is kind of interesting to note. There was an example of that on the Snake River in Idaho, where there was heavy ag industry, I guess, coming down the river in some way. And there was all of a sudden an area where like a ton of these nitrogen loving lichens showed up. Like, oh, that's interesting. Those weren't here before. What are they doing here? So.
Well, I am mindful of time, and I want to just honor the generosity that you have already given, Hannah, to the group. Do you have any closing thoughts or things that you want to touch on before we move into our closing prayer and remarks? Or
just remember that things in the air move. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't hurting some sort of system that impacts our lives and the lives of others. And that anything we can do will help.
Absolutely. And I think that actually is a perfect segue to our closing prayer and honoring the fact that we live in an interdependent system across all different dynamics in our world. So Reverend Carolyn, would you mind praying us out?
Sure. Let's pray. Creator God, we thank you for Hannah and Deb and those scientists and all of us who have placed in our hearts a concern and care for our creation. But I want to thank you especially, God, for the lichens, not only our brothers and sisters as being a part of the creation, but in many ways our teachers, and that which warns us and shows us how to live and work together with other parts of the creation, how we need each other, and gives us joy. We pray that you would be with us and inspire a group of people that can be able to do this work, to check out the lichens and listen to them and use what they teach us in order to improve the quality of our air and this world. So bless us as we go and spread the word. We pray this in the name of Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Amen. And I know that Hannah and Deb will be following up with people by email with all of the information and forms as well. So there'll be plenty of opportunity. We'll go ahead and also post our gathering in the coming week or so for other people to check out. But please know that if you are inspired and energized by this conversation, tell someone in your life and invite them to be part of this great collaboration and experiment as we care for all of creation together. From SpiritBound Digital Mission from the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I already put in the chat, we have upcoming events. We have worship on Sundays online. If you are someone who is spiritually curious, maybe involved in church and looking for supplemental worship or formation, or you just kind of like want to check it out, but online, SpiritBound is for you. So we also have a conversation with an author coming up in June. So I commend all of that to you. Thank you all for coming, and take care until our roads cross paths again. May God bless you and keep you. Good night, everybody.
Okay.